I had a Dr. Michael Greger on a couple days ago, and he's a scientist, kind of a big advocate of a plant-based diet. But he said in science, the solution to bad information is more information, not less information. And we've really felt the censorship in the last 9 weeks. For 9 years, I was never censored on any social media platform. And yet, when we started talking about COVID-19, when we started talking about implications of 5G, and when I used the V word for vaccine, literally pretty much everything was shut down, and our entire channel
Really?
of a quarter billion views has been threatened to be deplatformed on YouTube.
What?
Yeah. So that's why we're on this digital freedom platform right now, because Professor, a lot of the things that we talk about would be removed, and then I would be deplatformed because I've made so many violations. And again, these are scientists, doctors who've been in the field 20 years. Robert F. Kennedy, who's been studying, vaccines for 20 years, talking with scientific study backing, and yet it still goes against policies, community policies of these big platforms. If you ask me why, I don't even want to go down in that rabbit hole because, yeah, but there are people out there.
It's not clear.
It's not clear. I would say that, that the pharmaceutical companies definitely have power over the mainstream media, because I've been told by Robert F. Kennedy that in a non-election year, they're 70% of the advertising budget. So they kind of have this implicit, let's not talk about these things that might affect. Also in America, as you know, in America, they're these 2-minute long ads for these drugs you've never heard of. I mean,
one thing that hasn't been spoken about is that the people who die from influenza or COVID often die from bacterial infections. The lung gets messed up, and then bacteria get in there. And in some ways, these big pharma companies no longer put any money whatsoever into antibiotics. And that is, so if you really wanted to make a case against them, would be that a lot of these deaths we're getting now are due to the lack of development of antibiotics. And the reason is that antibiotics don't pay. It's a 10-day course. If you wanted to charge a lot of money for an antibiotic, the government would stop you. The drugs that are really good drugs are drugs that would give me, as a cancer patient, an extra half a year of good life when I'm 85 years old. I would definitely pay $500,000 for it, especially if this is my kid's money. So, what's the big deal? And I actually feel quite bad, because I did some work in the 80s on antibody therapy for cancer. And some of the very, very popular, high-selling cancer drugs like Avastin or Herceptin are actually made with a patent that I helped write in 1989. And it's to do with the fact of how you make antibodies in mice, and then you give them a makeover so that they're okay for people. And those drugs, have a lot of ethical challenges, because they're very expensive drugs. They're expensive to make, but they're great for the big pharma companies because, it's much easier. There's no regulation. I mean, it's much better to have a very expensive drug for a small audience than a very cheap drug for a big audience. Safety matters, etc. That's why vaccines are kind of like the last thing you want to be working on.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I was, funny enough, just talking to Dr. Greger, and he said, the most popular appointment for a doctor's office is a blood pressure check, because then they can adjust the levels of statins that you're on. And the statin is the blood pressure drug that probably most Americans are on, and you'll take the rest of your life. And so the pharmaceutical companies love it. They pay the doctors to do it. The food industry would rather you have that red meat, so you need it. Then they give the money to the politicians. So I don't like to go down the conspiracy level, but the point is that it's in everyone's financial interest, including the BMW dealership that sells the doctor the car, for this to continue in status quo. And if people speak against it, I think the forces kind of push it out. And I think
a very funny counterexample was that paper in Lancet on chloroquine.
Yes.
And that's a very interesting case, because I think well, basically, it was a paper. I mean, chloroquine has been recommended in certain circles, and I think a lot of people probably don't take those recommendations very seriously. But in any case, it was decided to do clinical studies of chloroquine, and then a paper was released basically pointing out all sorts of side effects of this clinical study that were actually wrong. So they stopped the clinical study, and then I think the Guardian newspaper looked into it and found that the statistics was all messed up. So basically, they had fabricated this case against chloroquine. They got the paper put into a very high-profile journal very, very quickly, and then it was wrong. And this puts, a lot of people have egg on their faces now, because I keep on trying to imagine the inverse. Imagine you had a paper that showed chloroquine was actually very useful. That would never have been fast-tracked into a journal.
Right.
I probably could have talked about it very quickly on Fox News. So you suddenly see these party lines, and it's very unpleasant. I mean, it's not just a two-way thing; it's a multi-way thing. It's big pharma, it's the big data companies, it's global things. It's actually a real pity, because you don't solve in how you deal with COVID is a difficult problem. It's a difficult problem, like relativity is a difficult problem. We don't, you have to make very difficult decisions. And clouding it with politics doesn't help. We could not have designed an atomic bomb in the United States if it had been a political thing. It would never have worked.
Yeah.
And politicians have to realize this, and I hope they do soon.